By the time people started warning me about the house at the end of Alder Street, I'd already signed the lease across from it. The warnings never came the way you'd expect. Nobody said the man living there was violent. Nobody said he was wanted for anything. They never even called the police on him, at least not in any way that stuck. It was always smaller than that, quieter. A pause that lasted too long when I mentioned the address. A look over the shoulder before someone lowered their voice. The cashier at the corner store asked where I'd moved from, smiled, made polite conversation, and the second I said, "Across from the greenhouse with the chain-link fence," her smile disappeared, like I'd told her someone had died. She leaned closer and said, "Do yourself a favor and don't ever knock on his door." That was it. No explanation. She rang up my groceries and acted like she hadn't said anything at all. At first, I thought it was just one of those neighborhood stories people like to build around a strange, older guy. Every block has one. Someone who never waves, never mows their lawn on time, maybe stares too long from the porch. People get bored, they fill in the gaps, and before you know it, there's a whole mythology around a man who probably just wants to be left alone. But from the day I moved in, I noticed something that made the place across from me feel wrong in a way that had nothing to do with gossip. Nobody ever walked on that side of the street. Not kids, not dog walkers, not joggers. Even delivery drivers crossed over before reaching his property, then crossed back once they passed it. It was subtle enough that I only caught it because I had a front window facing the street and I worked from home. I saw the pattern develop over days, then weeks. People treated that stretch of sidewalk like it was blocked off, even though nothing was there. The house itself looked ordinary in the kind of way that almost made it worse. Single story, faded green paint, shutters hanging slightly crooked, a narrow front porch with a rusted metal chair, and an old wind chime that never seemed to move, even on windy days. The yard was patchy and full of weeds, but not abandoned. It was maintained just enough to tell you somebody cared what it looked like. And the neighbor, my neighbor, was a man named Walter Creel. I learned his name from the mailman, who said it fast and under his breath, like he regretted bringing it up. Walter was probably in his late 60s, maybe older, thin but not frail, white hair cut too short, a long face with a tired, almost thoughtful expression that might have looked harmless if he didn't spend so much time standing perfectly still on his porch. That was the first thing I noticed about him. He didn't sit out there. He didn't smoke, read, or sip coffee. He just stood there with one hand resting on the porch rail, looking out at the street, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, never waving, never reacting if someone passed, just watching. The first time he acknowledged me, I was bringing in boxes from my car. I looked up and found him staring. Not casual curiosity, not a neighbor checking out the new tenant. He was locked onto me so intently, it made my shoulders go tight. I raised a hand and said, "Hey." He didn't wave back. He smiled instead. It should have made him seem friendlier, but it didn't. It was too slow, like the expression had to travel a long way before it reached his face. That night, I shut my blinds for the first time. A week later, I asked the woman next door about him while we were both taking out trash. I kept it light, just neighborhood small talk. But the second I said Walter's name, she gripped the lid of her bin hard enough for her knuckles to whiten. "Best to ignore him," she said. "Why? What did he do?" She looked toward his house before answering, and even then her voice dropped low. "Nothing you can prove." I almost laughed at that, but she wasn't joking. "What does that mean?" "It means people feel better when they don't look too closely." Then she went inside and left me standing there with my trash bag in one hand and a worse feeling than I'd started with. Things changed for me the first night I heard the knocking. It was around 2:15 in the morning. I only remember because I checked my phone right after it woke me. 3 slow knocks. Not on my front door, on the wall beside my bed. I lived alone, and my bedroom was on the second floor. There was no tree close enough to tap the siding, no loose branch, no reason for anyone to be outside that window in the middle of the night. I stayed completely still, listening, hoping I'd imagined it. Then it came again. 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, close enough to feel personal. I got out of bed and moved to the window, keeping back from the glass. My blinds were shut, but there was a thin gap near the edge. I looked down into my front yard and the street beyond. Walter was standing on the sidewalk directly below my window. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking straight up at me, like he already knew I'd be there. For a second, my brain refused to process it. It was too late, too strange, too quiet. He should have looked absurd, an elderly man in slippers standing under someone's window in the dark. Instead, he looked exactly like he belonged there. I stepped back so fast I hit my dresser. When I forced myself to look again, he was gone. The next morning, I told myself I dreamed it. Sleep paralysis, half-awake confusion, anything that let me keep functioning. But when I went outside, there were muddy prints in the flower bed beneath my window, deep heel marks, a narrow tread pattern leading in from the sidewalk and back out again. I took pictures. I almost called the police, but what was I going to say? My old neighbor stood on a public sidewalk at night and maybe tapped on my wall. It sounded weak, even in my own head, so I bought a camera instead. After that, my life became smaller without me realizing it. I stopped sitting on the front steps, stopped opening the blinds after dark, started checking the street before taking the trash out. I told myself I was being cautious, but really, I was rearranging my routine around a man who hadn't technically done anything. That was probably how Walter got away with whatever he was. The camera caught him 3 nights later at 2:13 a.m. Motion alert. I opened the feed on my phone with my heart already hammering. The angle showed my front yard, the sidewalk, and part of the road. Walter came into frame from the left, walking slowly in his robe. He stopped under my bedroom window, tilted his head back, and stayed there for almost 2 full minutes. Then he did something I still can't explain. He raised one arm and made a small motion with his hand, like he was beckoning to someone inside. Not knocking, not waving, inviting. I watched it 3 times before I noticed there was movement behind him, not in the street, in my house. A shadow crossed the upstairs hallway window. I froze. I lived alone. I had locked the doors. I had checked them twice before bed. But on the screen, clear as anything, something moved past the narrow side window near the top of my staircase. A shape taller than the window frame, crossing from one room to another. Walter never turned around. He just kept that hand raised, curling his fingers inward once, twice, like he was calling it closer. I ran upstairs with a kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other, every light blazing by the time I reached the hall. Nothing was there. No broken window, no open door, no sign anyone had been inside at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I took the footage to the woman next door. I don't know why her. Maybe because she was the only one who'd admitted he was a problem. She watched without interrupting, then sat very still for a long time. Finally, she said, "Did he ever ask to come inside?" "No, he will." That answer made my stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" She looked like she regretted saying anything, but the words came out anyway. "My husband talked to him once, years ago. Walter said he liked houses with room in them. Said some places were easier to open than others. A week later, my son started waking up screaming because he said there was a tall man standing in the hallway at night, always in the same place, always facing his bedroom. We moved out for 6 months. I just stared at her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Tell them what?" she snapped, then lowered her voice. "That a man across the street invites things into people's homes. You hear how that sounds?" I did. And the worst part was, after that footage, I didn't think she was crazy. 2 evenings later, Walter knocked on my front door just before sunset. It was the first time he'd ever come onto my property in daylight. I saw him through the peephole, and every instinct in my body told me to stay silent, but he kept knocking. Soft, patient, like he knew I was there and had all the time in the world. Finally, I said through the door, "What do you want?" His voice came back clear and calm. "I wanted to welcome you properly. I'm fine." There was a pause. Then he said, "You've already let it in, you know." I didn't answer. His next words came softer, almost sympathetic. "It's been standing behind you every night." I backed away from the door so quickly I nearly slipped. He chuckled then, not loudly, not like a threat, more like I had confirmed something he was hoping for. When I looked through the peephole again, he was still there, smiling faintly at the door. Then he leaned closer and whispered, "You should never look at the hallway window when I'm outside." I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and left through the back door. I spent the night in a motel off Route 8 and came back the next morning with 2 police officers. Walter's house was empty, not just empty in the normal sense. Stripped. No furniture, no dishes, no photos, nothing hanging on the walls. The place smelled stale and cold, like it had been shut for years. 1 metal chair on the porch, 1 bare bulb in the kitchen, and in the back bedroom, Dozens of small, hand-drawn floor plans pinned across the walls. Not of his house. Mine, and the one next door, and several others on the street. Each sketch showed windows, hallways, staircases, bedrooms. Some had notes written in tight block letters. Thin wall here. Easier from north side. Good view into child's room. One page just said, in darker pencil, asked to enter. Open longer after that. The police took photos, asked questions, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But Walter was gone, and without him standing there, the whole thing somehow became less believable, even with the drawings. Like the house itself was trying to deny he'd ever been in it. I moved out 3 days later. A month after that, the property management company called to ask if I had ever given anyone a key. I said no. They told me the new tenant had lasted 4 nights before breaking the lease. Said she kept hearing someone tapping on the wall beside her bed around 2 in the morning. They wanted to know if the house had any issues with pipes or branches. I told them to check the upstairs hallway window instead. There was a long silence on the line. Then the manager asked very carefully, "Why?" I almost answered. I almost told him about Walter on the sidewalk, the hand motion, the shadow upstairs, the floor plans, the whisper through the door. But I remembered what the woman next door had said. Nothing you can prove. So I just told him I didn't know. The last time I drove through that neighborhood, Walter's house was still empty. The yard was overgrown. The porch rail had finally collapsed on one side. But as I passed, I looked automatically at the upstairs hallway window of my old place across the street. There was someone standing there, not moving, not waving, just a tall, dark shape set back from the glass. And even from the road, even through sunlight, I had the certainty it wasn't watching the street. It was watching the house at the end of Alder Street, waiting for the front door to open again. Nobody in my building used the back stairwell after dark, and the reason always came out sounding stupid. During the day, people joked about it. They'd say it smelled weird, or the light on the 3rd floor landing kept burning out, or some homeless guy had probably slept there once and freaked everybody out. But at night, when you actually had to choose between the elevator and those stairs, nobody laughed. They just avoided looking at the heavy gray door beside the mailboxes and kept walking. I didn't know any of that when I moved in. I'd just gotten out of a bad breakup, found a cheaper apartment across town, and took the first place I could afford that didn't look like it was falling apart. The building wasn't great, but it was clean enough. 4 floors, old brick exterior, narrow hallways, radiator heat that clicked all night. The kind of place where you heard your neighbors cough through the walls but never learned their names. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, right at the end of the hallway, with my kitchen window facing the alley and the back stairwell running up the other side of the wall. Most nights, I'd hear the usual building sounds through it. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, pipes knocking. It all blended together after a while. Then, about a week after I moved in, I started hearing the dragging. Not every night, just often enough that I noticed it. A slow scrape on the stairs behind my kitchen wall, like someone was pulling something heavy one step at a time. It would start low, near the alley entrance, then climb, scrape, pause, scrape, pause. So slow, it made my skin crawl. The first time I heard it, I checked the peephole and then opened my door to look into the hallway, expecting to see somebody moving furniture or hauling trash bags upstairs. There was nobody there. The sound stopped the second I opened the door. I told myself it was the old pipes carrying noise from somewhere else in the building. That explanation lasted until I mentioned it to the tenant across from me, an exhausted-looking woman named Denise who was unlocking her door with 2 grocery bags hanging off one arm. She didn't even pretend not to know what I meant. "You hear it too?" she asked. I laughed a little just because of how quickly she said it. "Yeah, what is it?" She stared at the stairwell door at the end of the hall, then shifted her bags higher on her arm. "Don't answer if someone knocks from that side." I waited for her to smile. She didn't. "What?" "Sometimes people hear knocking from the kitchen wall or the stairwell door late at night. Don't answer it." "That doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't have to." She opened her apartment, stepped inside, and before closing the door said, "Just use the elevator after 10. That should have been the point where I started taking it seriously, but people say strange things in old buildings. Rumors spread fast in places where everyone's half lonely and tired. I figured there was probably some weird tenant history attached to the stairwell, something normal wrapped in enough retelling to become creepy. 3 nights later, I got home just after midnight and the elevator was out. I stood in the lobby for a good 10 seconds staring at the handwritten out of order sign, then looked toward the back stairwell door. It was already cracked open. I don't know why that bothered me as much as it did. It wasn't unusual. People use the stairs all the time during the day, but the lobby was completely silent, and that narrow black gap in the doorway felt less like convenience and more like somebody had left it open on purpose. I almost left and booked a motel for the night, which sounds ridiculous now, but that was my first real instinct. Instead, I told myself to grow up, pulled my keys tighter in my fist, and went in. The stairwell smelled damp and old, like wet concrete and dust. The motion-sensitive light above the first landing flicked on a second late, bathing the walls in that pale yellow color old bulbs have when they're about to die. Everything looked narrower than it should have. The steps were steep, the rail cold, and every sound I made came back to me too loudly. I had one foot on the second landing when I heard movement above me, not footsteps, breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone standing on the floor above, breathing through their mouth. I stopped and looked up. The stairs turned sharply so I couldn't see the third-floor landing from where I was, just the shadowed underside of the next flight and the metal railing leading into darkness. "Hello," I called. The breathing stopped. For a few seconds, I stood there listening so hard my ears rang. Then, very slowly, something tapped once against the railing upstairs. I backed down the stairs so fast I nearly slipped, shoved through the lobby door, and stood there with my pulse hammering in my throat. A minute later, a guy from the 4th floor came in carrying takeout, saw my face, and asked if I was okay. I told him there was someone in the stairwell. He looked at the open door, then at me, and said, "Was it on the 3rd floor landing?" I just stared. He shook his head like he was annoyed at himself for asking, then said, "Take the front stairs on the other side," and walked straight to the elevator as if he hadn't forgotten it was broken. The next morning, I asked the landlord whether somebody had been sleeping in the back stairwell. He got defensive immediately. No. Then why does everybody act weird about it? He gave me the kind of smile people use when they want a problem to go away without solving it. Old building. People tell stories. What kind of stories? But he was already pretending to sort papers on his desk. Nothing worth repeating. That night, I wedged a chair under my kitchen doorknob even though the door only opened into my apartment, not the stairwell. It made no logical sense. I just wanted some kind of barrier between me and that wall. At 1:47 a.m., I woke to 3 knocks. Not on my front door, on the kitchen wall. They were slow and hollow, like someone on the other side was using their knuckles against the plaster exactly where my table sat. I stayed in bed, instantly wide awake. 3 more knocks came, same place, same spacing. Then a voice, low and almost conversational, came through the wall. "Could you let me in?" Every muscle in my body locked. It wasn't muffled the way voices through walls usually are. It sounded close, too close, like someone had their mouth against the paint. I don't know how long I lay there staring into the dark before I finally reached for my phone. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I called Denise instead of the police, mostly because my brain was working on panic and instinct. She answered on the second ring. I whispered, "There's someone in the stairwell." Her voice changed immediately. "Did you answer?" "No." "Did you say anything?" "No." "Then don't move." The line stayed open. We didn't speak. I listened to the silence in my apartment while every few minutes another set of 3 knocks came from the kitchen wall. Around 2:20, I heard something worse. Footsteps. Not in the stairwell. In my hallway. Slow. Careful. Like someone walking through a place they already knew. I sat up so hard my vision blurred. My bedroom door was open a crack, and beyond it I could see the strip of darkness leading toward the living room. Another step sounded out, then another. The floorboards gave a small, familiar creak right outside my room. I couldn't breathe. Denise heard it through the phone before I did. She whispered, "Do not look." I don't know why I listened. Maybe because her voice sounded genuinely afraid. Maybe because some part of me knew that if I saw whoever had made it from the stairwell into my apartment without opening a door or window, something in my mind would break. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom. A few seconds later, the voice from the wall spoke again, but this time it wasn't in the kitchen. It was right outside my door. "Neighbor?" It sounded patient, pleasant even. Yeah, everyone avoids me too. I squeezed my eyes shut and stayed like that until morning light started turning the room gray. When I finally got up, my apartment looked untouched. Front door locked, windows shut, nothing missing. But the chair I had jammed under the kitchen doorknob was on the floor across the room, and written in the dust on my kitchen table, in thin streaks like someone had used 2 fingers, were the words, "Thank you for not answering. I moved out that weekend." A month later, I ran into Denise at a grocery store across town. I asked her what had happened in that building, and for once, she answered. Years earlier, a man on the 3rd floor had died in the back stairwell after pounding on doors for help. Heart attack, they said. He'd been a tenant everyone hated, nosy, always listening at doors, always trying to invite himself into people's apartments, always lingering too long in hallways, the kind of neighbor everyone avoided because he made your skin crawl. When they found him, one of his hands was bloodied from knocking against the wall beside a 2nd-floor unit after nobody let him in. I asked if that was supposed to make me feel better. Denise just looked at me and said, "It would, if the 3rd-floor apartment hadn't still been occupied when he died." I never asked anything about him again, but even now, whenever I move somewhere new, I check what's on the other side of my bedroom walls, and I never answer late-night knocking unless I know exactly which side of the door it came from. The first time I saw Mr. Weller, he was standing in my backyard at 2 in the morning with a flashlight pointed at my house. Not at the windows, not at the fence, at the house itself. The beam moved slowly across the siding, up to the 2nd floor, then back down again in a careful line like he was reading something written there. I'd just gotten up for water, and when I looked through the kitchen window and saw him, I froze so hard I almost dropped the glass. He wasn't supposed to be there. I had only lived in that rental for 6 days, but I already knew which neighbor people meant when they said, "Just keep to yourself on this block." They all meant the same man. The one in the yellowed 2-story house next door. The one with the dead rose bushes, the spotless porch, and the garage door that opened 3 or 4 times a night for no obvious reason. People never used his name unless they had to. They'd just say, "Him," or "the neighbor on your right," and then change the subject. The moving guy had noticed me looking over at the house while we unloaded boxes and said, "That one's trouble." "What kind of trouble?" He shrugged. The kind nobody wants to explain twice. Then he went back to carrying furniture, like he hadn't said anything strange at all. Over the next few days, I got more versions of the same warning. The mail carrier told me not to leave packages outside. A woman walking her dog crossed the street to introduce herself, welcomed me to the neighborhood, and then casually asked if I had curtains yet. At the hardware store, when I mentioned my address, the cashier asked, "You're not next to Weller, are you?" When I said yes, his mouth tightened. "Get good locks," he said. That should have been enough to make me pay attention, but when you move somewhere new, everybody's rumors sound bigger than they are. I figured Mr. Weller was probably just an unpleasant old man with a history of complaints. Nosy, rude, maybe drunk, maybe unstable in a way people knew how to manage by avoiding him. Then I saw him in my yard. He was old, but not frail. Tall, narrow shoulders, gray hair combed flat, always wearing the same dark jacket no matter the weather. Even from the window, I could see how still he stood. That was what made it wrong. Most trespassers, even weird ones, carry some nervous energy. They glance around, they shift, they react. Mr. Weller looked completely at ease, standing 10 feet from my back door in the middle of the night. I should have yelled. I should have called the police right then. Instead, I ducked away from the glass and stood there in the dark, with my heart pounding so hard it made my throat hurt. A minute later, I looked again. He was gone. The gate to the side yard was still latched from the inside. The next morning, I checked the grass. There were shoe prints under the kitchen window and a shallow dent in the soil near the basement access doors. I took pictures and texted them to my brother, mostly so somebody else would know I wasn't imagining it. He called immediately and told me to report it. I almost did. But the part I couldn't explain, the part that made me hesitate, was this. The basement doors weren't fully closed anymore. One sat half an inch higher than the other, like someone had tried them. I hadn't opened that basement once since moving in. That evening, I went down there for the first time. The stairs were steep and unfinished, the kind that complained under your weight. A single pull-chain bulb hung over the middle of the room, and when I switched it on, the basement looked exactly like every unfinished basement I'd ever seen. Cement floor, water heater, old shelves, exposed beams, a tiny rectangular window near the ceiling facing the backyard. Nothing looked stolen or disturbed. Still, I checked every corner. At the far end of the basement, behind the shelves, I found a narrow wooden door, almost hidden by the angle of the wall. It was painted the same color as the concrete around it, and without the bulb overhead, I probably would have missed it. There was no knob, just a small iron latch. I opened it expecting a crawl space. It was a room, not a finished room, not one anyone should have been using. Just a square chamber, maybe 8 feet across, with bare concrete walls and no windows. There was an old wooden chair in one corner and a hook in the ceiling with nothing hanging from it. That was all, but the dust on the floor had been disturbed recently. There were footprints, not mine, not the broad moving boot prints from when I'd first toured the place. These were narrow, sharp-edged shoe marks leading in, stopping near the chair, then turning back out. Fresh enough that the loose powder still looked kicked up along the sides. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them. Then I noticed something carved into the wall beside the chair. Not deep, not vandalism scratched in a hurry, just words pressed carefully into the concrete while it had still been soft, years ago. Stay quiet, and he will go away. I backed out so fast I hit my head on the low frame. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the landlord used the room for storage. Maybe a contractor had been down there recently. Maybe the message was some old joke left by whoever owned the house years ago. Every explanation I came up with sounded weak the second it formed. That night, I shoved a toolbox against the basement door and slept with every downstairs light on. At 3:11 a.m., something knocked from underneath the floor, 3 slow thuds, not on the front door, not on a wall, directly below the living room from the basement. I sat bolt upright on the couch, already awake because I hadn't really slept at all. For a few seconds, everything went silent again, and I almost convinced myself the sound had come from the heat kicking on. Then it came back. 3 knocks, a pause, then one more. Like whoever was down there knew I was listening. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, straight to voicemail. I called my brother, no answer. I actually opened the police number, thumb over the button, and then the knocking stopped. A minute later, motion lights came on outside in the backyard. I moved to the window and looked through the blinds. Mr. Weller was standing by the basement doors. He wasn't holding a flashlight this time. He just stood there in the pale security light, one hand resting on the door as if he were waiting for someone on the other side to unlock it. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked directly at my window. I dropped the blind immediately. When I finally got the nerve to look again, the yard was empty. The next day, I went around the block asking people directly about him. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. I needed somebody to stop talking in half sentences. Most people shut down the second I mentioned his name, but an older woman named Evelyn, who lived diagonally across from me, finally said, "You're in the Mercer house." I asked what that meant. She stood on her porch holding a watering can she'd clearly forgotten to use and said, "A family lived there before you. Husband, wife, little girl. Nice people. Kept to themselves." The husband started telling people Weller was coming onto his property at night, looking in windows, trying doors. Police came out twice, never caught him doing anything. What happened to them? Her face changed. The wife left first. Then the husband and daughter were gone a week later. House sat empty after that. Why? She hesitated so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, because the daughter kept saying there was another room under the basement and somebody was whispering to her through the floor. I felt my skin go cold. "There is another room," I said. Evelyn's watering can slipped a little in her hands. Then, "You need to leave." That afternoon, I bought cameras, new locks, and a cheap baseball bat I knew I probably wouldn't use right if it came down to it. I installed one camera over the back door, one facing the basement access, and another in the basement itself pointed toward the hidden room. At 1:56 a.m., the backyard camera sent an alert. Mr. Weller entered through the side gate without hurry, like he'd done it 100 times before. He walked to the basement doors and crouched beside them. For a moment, I thought he was picking the lock. He wasn't. He was speaking to the crack between the doors. His mouth moved for several seconds. Then he placed something flat on the ground and stepped back. Another alert hit from the basement camera. I opened that feed, and every hair on my arms lifted. The hidden room door was open. I knew I had latched it earlier. I knew it. On the screen, the basement stood empty under the yellow bulb. Nothing moved, but the small door behind the shelving, the one that led to the concrete room, was slowly swinging inward by itself, as though someone had just passed through. Then a shadow crossed the far wall, not in front of the camera, behind it. Something tall moved between the camera and the light without ever fully taking shape. Just a dark interruption, man-sized and wrong, gliding soundlessly toward the stairs. I ran downstairs before my brain could stop me. Bat in one hand, phone in the other, every light in the house blazing on behind me. The basement was empty. The hidden room stood open, and on the floor, just outside it, resting neatly in the dust, was a photograph. It was old and curling at the corners. A picture of my house taken from the backyard years ago, maybe decades. In the image, the basement doors were open, and standing in the darkness below them was a little girl I had never seen before. Behind her, deeper in the black, someone else was visible, just a shoulder, part of a face, one pale hand gripping the inside wall. Watching whoever took the picture, I heard a knock from above me, from inside the house, not at the front door, from the living room floor directly overhead. 3 slow knocks. I don't remember getting up the stairs. I just remember bursting into the kitchen and seeing the back door standing open. Mr. Weller was gone, but the thing he had left outside the basement doors was still there. A ring of old keys tied together with red string. I called the police, and this time I didn't hold back anything. The trespassing, the basement, the hidden room, the messages, the cameras. They came. They searched. They took the keys and the photo, and one officer went next door to speak to Weller. He came back 10 minutes later with a face I still remember. "The house is empty," he said. "What?" "Been empty for a long time." That made no sense. I had seen Weller. Everyone had. His porch light came on every night. His garage opened. His trash cans went to the curb. The officer asked if I was sure the man lived there. I just stared at him. The county ended up getting involved after records showed the property owner, Arthur Weller, had died 9 years earlier in his own basement after suffering a fall. He had no immediate family. Taxes were paid automatically from an estate account. Nobody could explain the recent signs of occupancy, not officially. They boarded the house up within a week. I didn't stay long enough to see if that helped. Before I left for good, I went into my basement one last time in daylight. I wanted to make sure there was nothing of mine left behind. The hidden room was empty again, except for the chair and the carved message on the wall. But beneath it, so faint I must have missed it before, were smaller words scratched in later. "He doesn't live next door." I moved out that same day. 3 months later, after I'd settled in another town, an evidence clerk called to ask if I wanted the photograph returned. I said no. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Probably for the best." I asked why. She told me the lab had enhanced the image, hoping to identify the little girl. They couldn't, but they did sharpen the figure behind her. It was Arthur Weller, or at least it had been, once. Same face, same frame, same flat gray hair, standing in the dark under my house years before he was ever supposed to die. And, according to the clerk, the worst part wasn't that he was there. It was where he was looking. Not at the girl, not at the camera. He was looking past both of them, toward the top of the basement stairs, like he could already see someone else coming down to join him.